I, for one, see no reason why we here at the Liberal Club shouldn't listen to what Jack Reed has to say. What would you say this war is about, Jack Reed?
Profits.
Okay, that was Warren Beatty from the movie Reds as Jack Reed, the author of Insurgent Mexico in 10 Days That Shook the World. It's a great movie, folks. I love it, and that's the opening scene, I believe, in Reds. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly here on 99.5 FM in New York City, WBAI. Also here on the Progressive Radio Network. Last week, we had Adam Hochschild on talking about his blockbuster book. Now, if you don't, you know Adam, you know his books. King Leopold's Ghost, Spain in Our Hearts, To End All Wars, Prophets and Chains, and The Mirror at Midnight. And the one that we have been discussing the last week and continuing today is this blockbuster, page turner, really an epic that reads like a historical novel. It's called American Midnight, and I urge you all to get it. So I think we're just going to set the stage. Last week we ended talking about the IWW Bill Haywood, the trial that started in late November or December of 1917, and actually spilled over until late 1918. So we left it there, and we're going to come back and talk a little more about that and what ensues in part two of this epic book, American Midnight. And we'll be right back. We're going to start. Last week, if you recall, we had the original version of Over There with Robert Murphy as the singer, but George and Cohen song. We have a different one. This really surprised me. So we're going to play this and come right back with Adam Hochschild.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. The king's on the run, on the run, on the run. Yeah, I'm calling you and me, every heart of liberty. Hurry right away, not delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud their boys in line. Over there, send the water over there.
All right, there it is. And joining us now is journalist, author, historian, and co-founder of Mother Jones magazine, Adam Hochschild. Welcome back, Adam.
Thank you, Randy. Great to be with you.
Have you heard or seen that version of Over There before?
I haven't, but it certainly was a popular song around 1917, 1918, celebrating those boys going to Europe to fight.
Yeah, but you know, he was an Italian, not even Italian American, he was Italian, and I don't know. Italy was heavily involved in that war. They lost 600,000 men. Mussolini supported that war, and he got kicked out of the Socialist Party because of it. So I don't know if he was singing for Italy or singing for the U.S., but that was part of the propaganda, was the music back then, and anything else that could propel the public into supporting the war. Am I correct?
Absolutely. You know, military music has always been the best recruiter that armies anywhere have ever had.
Right. You know, at the same time, there was a because the sentiment was not good. And Wilson knew it, that the sentiment for war, really, even with the Lusitania going down, there wasn't massive energy out there, people wanting to join. In fact, here's another tune that we found at the same time in 1915 that came out that was very popular in progressive and radical, atmospheres. To play this song, and maybe you can identify it.
And million mothers' hearts must break for the one who died in vain. Heads bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years. I heard a mother murmur through her tears. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let's take his our race, their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
I guess you remember that tune.
Well, I'm not quite old enough to remember it from 1917. Almost, but not quite. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
That was 1915, and so there was, anti-war sentiment. I mean, it was pretty widespread, particularly amongst union members and the Socialist Party going into 1916. That election year, there was a lot of pushback. And that's why Wilson, I suppose, did not make a commitment to the war.
Yeah, well, there were no opinion polls in those days, so we don't know the exact figure. But probably something close to a majority of people in the United States were enthusiastic about joining the First World War, but certainly a very significant and vocal minority were not. Most of them were on the left, people who felt that the workers of the world ought to be fighting the capitalists and not each other. Other people had ties to Germany or the various ethnic groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a lot of Americans, especially in rural areas and in the South, felt this was a quarrel on the other side of the ocean. It wasn't our business. And let those Europeans slaughter each other if they insist, but it's not our business to fight in. So there was a considerable amount of resistance to going to war when Wilson brought the country into war in 1917.
Well, did people understand? There was a blackout of the news coming out of the Western Front at that time. I'm not sure how well aware the public was. There were not a lot of stories coming our way from Europe because everything were American writers besides Jack Reed, who had widespread, listeners or viewers or readers. Were they aware of how bad things were? Were they, disseminating that kind of news?
Not really. People saw the casualty figures, which were enormous, of course, but in any war, the armies who are at the front are always trying to shape the way the story is told back home and to de-emphasize the horror and the terror and the brutality and the mud and the discomfort and just how awful it really was. So I think people saw war as it appeared in the newsreels then, where our side, the Allies, now that we had joined them in 1917, were always advancing, never retreating. These romantic fighter pilots were dueling in the skies and, of course, always succeeding in shooting down German planes at the end. So, most Americans had that view of the war.
Right. And, before we jumped into the war, 1917, and really didn't get anybody over there until late in the year or the year after. But the Brits were certainly not aware of how bad it was. I'm going to play a segment from this documentary by my dear friend John Pilger from The War You Don't See. And this is a 1-minute clip that definitely accentuates how bad it was.
This was the slaughter known as the First World War. 16 millions died and 21 million were wounded. At the height of the carnage, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, had a private chat with the editor of The Guardian, C.P. Scott. If people really knew the truth, said the Prime Minister, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't know and can't know. The British public were desperate for real news. More than half the nation flocked to see an official propaganda film, The Battle of the Somme. Cameras were so unusual that young troops would shout, "Hello, Mum," as they marched to the front, and they were heard crying for their mothers as they died on the battlefield. This was almost never reported.
Right, so we didn't see that. I think Wilson was aware of how bad it was, and that's the reason why he, his heavy-handedness against people who resisted the draft and anyone that spoke out against the war, that explains it, because he wanted this war to go and didn't want anything to get in the way.
That's right. And from that fact stemmed a huge wave of political repression, which most people in this country are simply not aware that we went through. After the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, in the next 4 years, roughly 1,000 Americans went to prison for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods, solely for things that they wrote or said. And this was usually speaking out against the U.S. taking part in this war. Press censorship on a huge scale. Some 75 newspapers and magazines shut down by the federal government. Vigilante violence, also encouraged by the federal government. All this for the purpose of suppressing dissent against that war.
Well, we left it. Now, the IWW and especially Big Bill Haywood was against this war. We left it the last time with the trial with the Kennesaw Landis at the helm in that courtroom in Chicago. It spills over until like August of the following year. But there were some things that happened that in the interim we didn't talk about. Some of the stories, the repression against anyone, the immigrants that were German, anyone that spoke out. But the immigrants, like the Kentucky Three, Carl Schoberg, can you tell us about that story a little bit?
Yeah, Schoberg was a cobbler of German descent, but he'd been in this country since the age of 5 in Covington, Kentucky, right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. And he, ran a shop where he repaired shoes and chatted with customers when they came in. And one day in early 1918, a couple of guys showed up at his shop and said, "We're here to fix your electric meter." And so they went to the back of the shop, fiddled with the meter, and were there for a while. A couple months later, they came back, said the meter needed to be repaired further, did some more work on it, then they went away. And a couple months after that, Schoberg and 2 of his friends were startled to be arrested and charged with treason under the Espionage Act. The people fixing the electric meter, so-called, were private detectives who'd been hired by a local vigilante group to plant a microphone in Schoberg's shop. And they had recorded with this microphone his having private conversations with his 2 friends about the progress of the war. And they had said things like, "Wow, aren't those German generals pretty damn good?" Which was a sensible enough thing to say in 1918 when Germany, with its pioneering stormtrooper tactics, had broken through the Allied front lines and looked as if it was about to be able to capture Paris, which would have really upended the war. But for these and other remarks, these 3 guys were charged under the Espionage Act and sentenced to federal prison simply for opinions they had voiced to each other in the privacy of this cobbler's shop. This was the sort of an index of the kind of insanity and paranoia that was in the air in this period.
Wow. I mean, we're talking about some primitive, taping machines. I mean, we got the NSA today, the CIA, that can catch just about anything. But back then they had these primitive microphones. One was on. You got to read the book to get that full story. Another one was Robert Prager in Illinois. That's a real ghastly story.
Yeah, Robert Prager was a coal miner in Collinsville, Illinois, who had the bad luck to be German-born. And at one point, a drunken mob of men on the streets of that city seized him, stripped off most of his clothes, wrapped him in an American flag, forced him to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and lynched him from a tree on the outskirts of town. 11 members of the mob were put on trial. They were photographed proudly, dressed in their Sunday best in front of the county courthouse. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, found them all innocent, while a military band played in the rotunda of the courthouse. This was an example of the kind of anti-German paranoia in the air, which very quickly became transformed after the Russian Revolution in the fall of 1917 into a sort of anti-leftist paranoia. That person speaking some foreign language you didn't know on the street corner who might be a German spy, now might be a Russian spy. So the wartime anti-German paranoia really transformed into this other kind of paranoia and continued for several years after the war ended.
Well, the German stuff went on for a long time, and it was really, agitated by the propaganda. That like what was going on in Hollywood. There were movies called The Secret Game, the Prussian Cur, and the Hun Within, and it was those type of propaganda movies and anything else that was inflammatory that set off the public to be so vigilant against German Americans, particularly Jewish German Americans in this country. I mean, the DOJ was getting, I think in the book it says 1,500 letters a day from people that were fingering German Americans.
Yeah, everybody was very paranoid about spies. And since there were something like 8 million German Americans, there were targets everywhere for this paranoia. But the United States has always had a sort of strong streak of xenophobia where anything that's a problem, it must be the fault of this or that group of foreigners among us. And this streak of paranoia, xenophobia, was certainly very much in evidence in those years, 1917 to 21, and it very quickly got attached to left-wing politics of any kind. Socialists, communists were always seen as advancing the interests of a foreign power.
Right. Well, that's why, justified Wilson going after the IWW. That trial lasted, it started in late November and ended, I guess there were a lot of continuations. But between that and August, when they were finally convicted, they thought, well, we've quelled the IWW. We've dealt them a severe blow. Now they're going after the socialists. And this is what part two, and in particular, Eugene Debs. You had midterm elections coming up, and the administration was concerned that the socialists might hold the balance of power in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, this was something very scary for the administration of Woodrow Wilson. His Democrats controlled the House of Representatives only by a very small margin, just a few votes, much as is the case right now with the Republicans. And they were terrified that the socialists, who had actually done very well in municipal elections in the fall of 1917, getting more than 20% of the vote in 14 major cities, they were very afraid that the socialists might get a few seats in the House of Representatives and therefore hold the balance of power. And the Socialist Party was strongly committed against American participation in the war. So Wilson and his administration went after the socialists. They used their censorship weeklies and monthlies all over the country.
Well, it started out early before they got to Debs. They started out with Kate Richard O'Hare, And then they went for the top gun, which was Debs, Eugene Debs. But he was really concerned with Debs. Could get 6% of the vote. He had been running since 1904 and maybe 1900. And he got from 2% all the way to 6%. But he sat out. And somebody said that he got like half of that because they didn't want to disrupt Wilson, thinking they might win that, that he'd keep us out of the war. Tell us about Kate Richard O'Hare, because she plays a big part in your book.
Yeah, Kate Richards O'Hare was the Socialist Party's most popular woman speaker. She had been socialist candidate for Congress, for the Senate. She was particularly popular in the Midwest, the prairie states, because she'd grown up on a farm in Kansas. She knew how to speak to people in a language that they would understand, and she drew crowds of thousands of people when she went around the country speaking against the war, which she was doing from April 1917 on. She was arrested in South Dakota after an anti-war speech, quite promptly put on trial, sentenced to 5 years in prison for her anti-war positions. The first of many socialists to go to jail during this period. When she went to prison, to the Women's Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri, she found herself in the very next cell to Emma Goldman, the anarchist. Now, these people represented different strands of left-wing politics on the outside and might well have been political enemies or competitors there. But in prison, they became fast friends, and they each wrote down their memories of the other. And when you're a writer like me, who's trying to build a narrative through telling a story through, a dozen or so different characters, when two of your characters get to know each other and comment on each other and remember things about each other, that's just a writer's dream.
Right. Those letters that they wrote back and forth are really moving, and all the way through, they maintained a correspondence. And she later became she worked with the California Department of Corrections and instituted a lot of changes from a reform-minded commissioner. It's in the book, and that comes later on. So she was the first blow that Wilson's administration dealt. It was Gregory was the attorney general at the time. It wasn't the other guy who came in later.
Palmer. He came a little later.
Yes, yeah. Right? So we'll get to him. But Debs. So Debs is the guy. Also, the socialists were big, as you explained in the book and so vividly show. Like in New York State, in New York City, there were 10 state senators sitting in the state of New York State Senate that were socialists. And back then, we probably only had 40 senators.
Yeah, actually, there were 10 members of the Assembly, the larger lower house of the state legislature, but still, that's a considerable number. For any party to have 10 legislators in a legislative chamber around the country is significant. And socialists became mayors in this era of cities as diverse as Milwaukee, Schenectady, Pasadena. There were more than 1,000 socialists elected to state or municipal office around the country. I don't think American socialism ever would have had the following that the socialist parties had in Western Europe later in the 20th century. But I think if it had not been so ruthlessly crushed during this period, with so many socialists sent to jail, I think the party might have had a more significant presence on the American political scene and pushed the two major parties farther in the direction of the kind of social legislation, better social safety net, really comprehensive national health care system that we find not just in Western Europe, but across the border in Canada.
Right. Getting back to what New York State now, New York City, and Hillquit, who was the head of the Socialist Party. I think he's the one who delivered that speech in Reds that caused the CPLA, the Communist Party, the Communist Labor Party, and the Communist Party of America to split into two groups. But as a New York City mayor, he became the focus of the ire of Gregory and of Wilson. because of he wouldn't buy war bonds, and he used his platform. He was a candidate for mayor.
Candidate for mayor, right. And in 1917, he got 22% of the vote in New York City. And this scared the daylights out of the Wilson administration and was one of those things, and you can actually trace it through letters and messages that Wilson and his cabinet members sent to each other. It was one of those things that really made them determined to crack down on the socialists.
Yes. But the big kahuna was Debs. And Debs, they wanted to definitely eliminate him. And there was this COINTELPRO type of operation against him, this disinformation. Can you talk about that and how basically it ensnared him into a trap?
It really, we don't know exactly where it came from, but in early 1918, the government was really worried about Debs. And then there began to be what we would call today a disinformation campaign, where mysterious newspaper articles began appearing all over the country saying Eugene Debs has changed his mind and is now backing the war. Debs calls for support for our troops and so on. Debs kept issuing statements saying, this is not true. I never said anything like this. Very few daily papers would reprint those statements of his. We don't know where this stuff came from. One theory that one historian has is that it was a sort of special dirty tricks branch of U.S. military intelligence that planted these stories in the newspapers. In any case, it made Debs more outspoken than ever about the war. And in the summer of 1918, he gave a speech from a bandstand in Kenton, Ohio, a park in Kenton, Ohio, strongly denouncing the war. And for this, he was arrested, charged under the Espionage Act, placed on trial before a judge who just happened to be the former law partner of Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of War, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was whisked off to federal prison immediately, and he was still behind bars more than 2 years later, when in November of 1920, he received more than 900,000 votes for president as a convict in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta.
Right. Well, earlier that day, when he made that speech, he had visited 7 people evading the draft, COs, in a local jail. And can you describe the conditions that he saw when he visited them?
Yeah, people who objected to the draft, refused to be drafted, or once they were, refused to obey orders and given to them by the Army, were treated in a very nasty way. And 2 of the people in the jail that Debs visited that day had actually been hung from their wrists, from a rafter in the jailhouse, and they told Debs about this when he visited them. This was a kind of routine punishment because people who resisted the draft were judged to be in the Army but refusing orders. And if, as prisoners, they refused to do the 8 hours of manual labor that was required of them each day, they were chained to their cell bars for 8 hours a day. Plus, they were given horrible diets. They're often beaten up by guards. It's not surprising that more than a dozen conscientious objectors died behind bars in 1917, 1918.
Well, I guess the preponderance of those who were convicted and sent to prison went to this Camp Funston in Kansas, which was run by General, we talked about him last time, Leonard Wood. Talk about the conditions there and the way they treated soldiers, particularly black soldiers.
Yeah, well, this was, I think in all countries, there's always a risk that sadists are going to gravitate towards jobs as prison guards because it's a job where you get to push people around. You get to feel your power over somebody who's even more powerless than you are. And I think during wartime especially, the guards in these military prisons wanted to show that they were just as tough as those soldiers who were over there fighting the war in France. So there are repeated accounts of brutality against the war resistors, against the conscientious objectors, people having their heads shoved in toilets, people chained to their cell bars, as I mentioned, for 8 hours a day, people given horrible food, people beaten with rods and whips, given a terrible diet. And this happened everywhere. Camp Funston, Kansas, which had the largest collection of conscientious objectors, happened to have as its commander General Leonard Wood, who had his eye on the Republican presidential nomination in 1920. He was a blood and thunder type who had fought in the Philippines, had fought in the Indian Wars, had fought putting down strikers here in the United States, and he wanted to show that he was tough. So he was the worst possible person to be in a position of commanding conscientious objectors, but that was one of the things he was in charge of at this army base.
Right, and this is also a training base as well. It wasn't just a prison; it was a training base, Camp Funston. Right?
No, you're thinking of the camp in Iowa, where Camp Dodge, where those 3 black soldiers were hung.
Right, at Camp Dodge. You're right. Here it is, the 92nd Division, which fought after the war had come to an end at 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918. So the war had come to an end at that point, but it went on for 6 more hours. And there were 3 soldiers there that were black that were hanged for this rape. Can you talk about that?
Well, this was something that happened at this training base, Camp Dodge, where there were tens of thousands of soldiers being trained. And in 1918, when the war was on, all these thousands of soldiers were assembled to watch a public hanging. And the victims were 3 black soldiers who were accused of raping a white woman who was a telephone operator at the base. We don't know the actual facts of what happened, but we sort of do know that throughout the American South, particularly, and sometimes elsewhere in the country, for decades, the pretext for a lynching was almost always that a black man had allegedly made some move towards a white woman. I suspect that in most of the cases, nothing whatever happened. Some cases, just a glance was enough to get somebody lynched. Some cases, maybe something more did happen. We'll never know. Anyway, these 3 black soldiers were hanged. Of the soldiers who were assembled, the thousands of soldiers who were assembled to watch them be hanged, the black troops were not issued any rifles. All other soldiers had rifles. And I think they were afraid that the black troops would interfere to try to stop the hanging. It was a shattering experience for these guys to watch a lynching that was essentially organized by the army. Soon after that, they went off to France, the 92nd Division, which was all black with some white officers. They fought very bravely, and they were one of the American units that was in the front line, as you mentioned, where after the armistice was signed at 5 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, 1918, that armistice didn't take effect until 11 a.m. that morning. But insanely, the generals on the Allied side gave orders that firing and attacks were to continue without let-up until 11 a.m. And this black unit, the 92nd Division, suffered particularly that day, losing dozens of men, having hundreds wounded, just in those last 6 hours of the war, when everybody knew the war was going to come to an end at 11 o'clock. Why did they have to keep fighting? One of the most insane things about an insane period of history.
Well, now the war is over. Peace talks are beginning. Wilson goes to France, to Paris for months and months. But now that the war's over, what happens here. There's no more war, no reason to censor mail, no reason to go after people on espionage charges, but they continue, especially the Postmaster General. He tells them, all right, let's let up on the censorship. But Burleson, the Postmaster General, continues.
Right. The Postmaster General had the authority under the Espionage Act to declare a newspaper or magazine unmailable. It could not travel through the U.S. mail. And of course, in the days before the internet, radio, TV, this was the only way that a publication had of reaching its readers. Weeklies, monthlies, journals of opinion, almost the entire socialist press, almost the entire foreign language press depended on the mail. Albert Burleson of Texas, the Postmaster General, in charge of this whole censorship operation, which was run, incidentally, from Post Office headquarters, the building that 100 years later would become the Trump International Hotel. He loved censoring. He kept on doing it right until he left office with the rest of the Wilson administration in March 1921, even though this censorship had supposedly been required by the war, which was now long over. So it just kept going on.
Right. And very few dissidents were released from jail, if any. And then O'Hare is sent to prison. Her, as you mentioned, her appeal is denied. And then the big case, Schenck, his and Schoberg's, both of their appeals are denied.
Right. The Schenck case was the one that people who cared about civil liberties put their hopes in. In early 1919, a test case testing the legitimacy of the Espionage Act came before the Supreme Court. Schenck was a young socialist in Philadelphia who'd been convicted of violating the Espionage Act by mailing out leaflets opposing the draft. And civil liberties types hoped that the Supreme Court would treat this as a test of the Espionage Act itself and find the act unconstitutional. To their dismay, the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act, upheld the decision in this case unanimously, and even more dismay, the decision was written by one of the people they'd placed the most hopes in, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And it was then that he made his famous statement that, free speech is free speech, but it doesn't give you the license to yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, taking a principled opposition to the idea of conscription is not the same thing as causing a panic in a crowded theater. So people were tremendously disappointed in Holmes. However, one thing you have to say for this man, he was large enough to change his mind. About 6 or 8 months later, another case came before the court, the Abrams case, again a case involving people prosecuted for distributing leaflets under the Espionage Act. And over the summer, after many talks with fellow lawyers, other judges, Holmes had changed his mind, and he announced that he was going to oppose upholding this Abrams decision, which was sending people to prison for writing these leaflets. His fellow justices were appalled. They were so dismayed that most unusually, 3 of them came to see him at his house and tried to talk him out of this rash dissent, said, we have to stick together, defend our country just the way you were, an officer in the Civil War in the Union Army, and you defended your country and you were wounded. It's the same situation today, which was complete nonsense. And Holmes said, no, I'm going to dissent in this case. We know about that conversation because Holmes's law clerk was listening in from the next room through a half-open door. Holmes persuaded his colleague Louis Brandeis to join him in that dissent, and they opposed the Espionage Act in this decision. Supreme Court dissents don't make law, of course, but I think their dissent had enormous reverberations and led to a somewhat more progressive Supreme Court over the remainder of the 20th century.
Well, I'm looking at all these cases throughout the book, nobody got acquitted, and anyone that was convicted that appealed never got, except for Victor Berger. That's the only one. But it's like there was no chance. And, you know, we were talking about the IWW, that case in Chicago that took place in 1917, 1918. And then in Chicago, and there was that melee at Grant Park. And so I'm looking at 50 years later in Chicago, Grant Park, the demonstrators against the war. And I want to play something for you. This is the
I was there in Grant Park in 1968 at the National Convention. I was there.
I know there's a file on you. All right, you were there. You were a bad boy. Now I want to play my godfather, Bill Kunstler, spoke after the convictions on contempt for everybody in Chicago, the Chicago 7. He came out the next day. And they had the same type of judge. I mean, Hoffman, Julius Hoffman was no different than Landis. So let me play this. I play this a lot. I think that this is from a documentary by his kids, Emily and Sarah Kunstler, called Disturbing the Universe. Kelly?
And that's the terrible myth of organized society, that everything that's done through the established system is legal. And that word has a powerful psychological impact. It makes people believe that there is an order to life and an order to a system, and that a person that goes through this order and is convicted has gotten all that is due him, and therefore society can turn its conscience off and look to other things and other times. And that's the terrible thing about these past trials, is that they have this aura of legitimacy, this aura of legality. I suspect that better men than the world has known, and more of them, have gone to their death through a legal system than through all the illegalities in the history of man. 6 million people in Europe during the Third Reich, legal. Sacco Vanzetti, quite legal. The Haymarket defendants, legal. The hundreds of rape trials throughout the South, where black men were condemned to death, all legal. Jesus, legal. Socrates, legal. And that is the kaleidoscopic nature of what we live through here and in other places. Because all tyrants learn that it is far better to do this thing through some semblance of legality than to do it without that pretense.
Okay, I'm throwing the ball in your court. Your thoughts?
That's a very powerful speech. And he was your godfather, Kunstler.
Well, you know, I lived in this house. I ran the Kunstler Fund for 15 years, and I lived in his basement there for 1986 to 1996.
Well, I think he's got a good point, though, which is that the law is usually an instrument of those who hold power. And those who hold power mold the law, make new laws in order to allow them to do what they want to do. The prime example of that from the period that I wrote about in American Midnight is the Espionage Act, which was pushed through Congress very quickly by Woodrow Wilson in mid-1917 and allowed all of these cases that we're talking about, Kate Richards O'Hare, Debs, many others, you know, people sent to jail for speaking or writing their opinions, which should not happen in our country. It should not happen in any country. But it did happen then. And as Kunstler would say, it was all legal because the law, the Espionage Act, allowed it.
Right. And, you know, I don't know. I'm looking at these cases. I don't see anybody playing out. They all went to trial.
Well, actually, there were there were some acquittals under the Espionage Act. They tried, for example, to send John Reed and other people who worked for the magazine The Masses. They tried to send them to jail, but they didn't succeed. That was perhaps the most famous acquittal of this period. And there were some others as well. But to me, the horrible figure is the roughly 1,000 people behind bars for a year or more, solely for things that they wrote or said. This is an assault on civil liberties such as we've never seen since the end of slavery in the United States.
Right. We're talking with Adam Hochschild, the author of this book. I'm going to show it again here. It's called American Midnight. You see it right here? There it is, American Midnight. Please get this book. It, like I said, it really does read like a historical novel, and that's the highest compliment. The way you weave these stories together, how they come in and go out and come back in. The Kate O'Hare, for example. I want to go back to the war's over, but things are not good at home. I mean, you got how many millions of soldiers returning to the U.S., and how bad was the economy, and what were the implications of that?
In 1919 was a very violent year. There were roughly 4 million men demobilized from the military and coming back home, coming out of the job market during that period. And the jobs weren't there because the factories that had been making planes and tanks and guns and artillery pieces and ships and so on for the war were shut down. Furthermore, there was a lot of competition for those jobs between the 9/10 or so of those soldiers who were white and the 10% who were black. And I think this was really what led to the explosion of racial violence in the United States in the summer of 1919. In the history books, these are talked about as race riots, but really they should be called white riots, because in almost all cases they were initiated by white people who were angry that blacks were threatening to compete with them for jobs, to move into their neighborhoods, and so on. This was exacerbated by the Great Migration as Black Americans fled the South, trying to get out of an area of the country where there was often one lynching a week somewhere in the South. They were flooding into northern cities. White Northerners, for the most part, didn't want them there. And it was a very violent summer. In city after city after city, white mobs attacked black people, rampaged through black areas, setting fire to buildings and so on. We don't know the full death toll because the most violent episode of that summer happened at a place called Elaine, Arkansas, where a combination of white militia and local vigilantes killed several hundred black people who were trying to form a sharecroppers union. And the bodies of many of the victims were simply tossed into the Mississippi River and floated downstream. And we do not to this day know how many were.
And they flocked to Chicago. A lot of people flocked to Chicago. Chicago seemed to be the hub of a lot of these high-profile trials and a lot of migration. Now, Wilson continues. He's obsessed with the League of Nations. He's obsessed with it. And he goes on this train tour. And at the time, the inflation is high. He's totally oblivious to it. And he's in Seattle when there's he actually meets with some Wobblies in Seattle. But there's a strike going on. I mean, there are 4 million people on strike in the U.S. at that period of time in 1919.
Yeah, 4 million Americans went on strike. 1 out of every 5 workers in this country went on strike at some point during 1919. Wilson was single-mindedly focused on the League of Nations, his great idealistic dream for this forum where countries would settle their differences peacefully instead of going to war. And, you have to grant him a certain idealism on that score. It's obviously better to talk than to fight. Whether the League of Nations, with the United States as the strongest power within it, which was what he envisioned, would have actually stopped wars from breaking out, I don't think so. I don't think it would have been any more effective than the UN has been since 1945. But he was single-mindedly focused on this, set off while he was in ill health on this month-long speaking tour around the country, day after day after day, giving 2 or 3 speeches a day in baseball stadiums and auditoriums, all this in an age before public address systems. So you wanted to reach, 10,000 people in a baseball stadium, you had to shout. Tremendously stressful for a man in bad health. In addition, every stop he made around the country, he's getting more news about strikes going on, big steel strike, big coal strike. All the police force in Boston was on strike. The police going on strike? That had never happened before. And he's more and more horrified by this. Then he gets to Seattle on this tour, and just driving from the railroad station to his hotel, he sees all these somber-faced men standing on the sidewalk, not cheering, wearing placards tucked into their hat bands saying, "Free political prisoners." These were Wobblies who had come from all over the Northwest. Amazingly, the next day, he agreed to receive a delegation of Wobblies at his hotel suite, and 5 of them went to talk to him and to present a petition. And these poor Wobblies were so astonished and tongue-tied at finding themselves in the presence of the President of the United States at last that they could not manage to say very much. They presented their petition and left. It didn't change the administration's attitude about anything, unfortunately. And then a couple of weeks after that, Wilson suffered the first of several near-fatal strokes that essentially knocked him out of office, out of activity for the rest of his presidency.
Okay, I'm going to take this break here. I'm going to say goodbye to the listeners this week in New York City and continue. I want to go move on to the Red Scare when we come back, if you don't mind sticking around.
I'll be here.
Okay, so we're going to play, I think it's appropriate, this Joe Hill. You can set it up. Joe Hill was, tell us about Joe Hill in 1 minute here.
Joe Hill was a Wobbly, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, Swedish-born, who was their top songwriter. He was also an activist, an organizer, and he was executed by a firing squad after being convicted of murder on much disputed evidence in Utah in 1915. And supposedly, among his last words, he said, "Don't mourn for me, organize."
Okay, with that, this is, there are a lot of versions of this song, but I was able to unearth this, and we're going to go out to New York listeners, and we'll be back for those watching us on our websites right back. This is Paul Robeson singing the Ballad of Joe Hill.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe. I didn't die, says Joe. I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they forgot to kill went on to organize. Went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where common men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he.
Okay, that's a powerful rendition,
Wow.
1944.
Who wrote the Ballad of Joe Hill? Was it Woody Guthrie?
No. It's somebody else. I don't know, but it was either that version or one by Utah Phillips, and I decided to play this one. But it was written, I don't even know what may have been. It may have been. I don't know. I didn't actually look. I was just looking for the best rendition of it, and I thought,
What a voice.
yeah,
Paul
that was
Robeson.
a live performance, I think, at Carnegie Hall. I mean,
Wow.
it was another benefit that he did, Paul Robeson. And we're not talking about Robeson today, but 40 years later, 35, 40 years later, after the first Red Scare, he would be a victim of a second Red Scare. You haven't written about Paul Robeson yet.
Oh, I'll get to that one of these days, maybe.
All right, so we're going to get back to the first Red Scare, and I want to go because I don't know if I got to this. I know I didn't. I want to talk about this guy here, the open shop. First, I want to talk about the open shop map and the gentleman that developed it.
Oh, you're talking about the map of Manhattan.
Yes, the
Yeah,
open
okay.
the NY. It's the NYS map. Yes.
Yeah. All right. This was a remarkable thing. One of the extraordinary characteristics of this period of intense repression, 1917-21, the subject of American Midnight, is that U.S. military intelligence developed this enormous program for spying not on the Germans, with whom we were at war for the first part of that period, but on American citizens. There were roughly 1,000 people at work, military and civilian, and military intelligence, gathering information on American civilians whom they considered dangerous or dissenters in one way or another. New York City's military intelligence was under the command of a man named John B. Trevor, who was a blue blood, very wealthy New Yorker from a very influential family. And his big bugaboo was immigrants. He wanted to monitor the ones who were here and keep more from coming in. In 1919, he prepared a remarkable map of Manhattan that showed where these dangerous categories of people lived. This map was color-coded, so some districts were coded red, black, blue, green, gray, according to whether the people who lived there were Russian Jews, who might be communists or anarchists, Italians, who might be anarchists, Irish, who might be Irish Republican Army supporters, or Black, who were, of course, an all-round danger. And this map was on display everywhere. He gave it to congressional committees. He gave it to the New York National Guard, gave it to the city fathers in New York. Everybody thought it was a remarkable achievement, making this map to bring these dangers to public attention. Trevor also prepared a military plan for the defense of New York, indicating how many rifles and machine guns and so on would be needed to defend the city against an uprising that presumably would come from within it somewhere. The Army overall developed a war plan for putting the whole United States, or as many states of it as were necessary, under martial law in case of an uprising. War Plan White, it was called, 59 pages. After the paranoia died down by 1921 or so, I wish I could say Trevor merely went back to his fancy Upper East Side brownstone, but he didn't. He remained active for the rest of his life in the cause of keeping immigrants out of the United States, and he was one of the principal co-authors of the 1924 immigration bill, which essentially slammed the door on immigrants to this country, or any significant number of immigrants, for more than 40 years. That was the law that kept Holocaust refugees out of the U.S.
So they were operating on the 1918 Immigration Act that was one in 1903, but this supposedly, and the committee head was Albert Johnson. It was I think, I don't know if he was a committee head then, but he was very close. He was an anti-immigrant. Was it Albert Johnson?
He was from 1919 on. He was head of the House Committee on Immigration, also a big hawk on keeping immigrants out of the country. And he and John B. Trevor became very close friends and really together helped craft that 1924 bill.
Right. But this guy, Johnson, is some character. I mean, he really rode the anti-immigration crusade for a long period of time. And the oddity of those two together, Johnson and Trevor, who was a rich blue-blooded guy, and Johnson, who was,
Johnson was a small-town rural newspaperman from Washington State who had actually belonged to a vigilante group that beat up Wobblies and the like in his youth, and very crude, hard-drinking guy. But he became big buddies with Trevor, who was from a very different sort of background, and together they worked for their great cause, as they saw it, of keeping immigrants out of the United States.
Immigrants and communists. I want to talk about the Overman subcommittee a little bit, which I didn't know about until I read your book.
Yeah, the Overman Committee was under Senator Overman of North Carolina, a Southerner who had once helped filibuster an anti-lynching bill to death. And they began during this period investigating people for their subversive tendencies. The first of many congressional committees to do this. That process continued in the 30s and the 40s and in the 50s, most notoriously under Senator Joseph McCarthy. There was a tremendous amount of paranoia in the air, having to do with the Russian Revolution. People projected onto the Russian Revolution all sorts of fears that they had about what might happen in the United States. You know, the great unwashed laboring class would seize power. Another fear they projected onto the Russian Revolution was the idea that somehow women would take power from men. I can read you a remarkable bit of testimony given before that committee. For example, this was given by the US Commerce Department official who claimed that in Russia, women were now nationalized. And when he came before the committee, he read aloud what he claimed to be an official decree from the city of Vladimir, declaring that all women over 18 were, quote, the property of the state and were required to register at the Bureau of Free Love of the Commissariat of Surveillance. Having registered at the Bureau of Free Love, she has the right to choose from among the men between the ages of 19 and 50 a cohabitant husband. The consent of the man in said choice is unnecessary. So this is a pure projection of paranoia, of men afraid of being ruled by women. So they imagine that in Russia, where mysterious things are going on, but nobody really knows what they are, they have projected the idea that somehow women are able to choose whatever men they want as husbands and men have no power over this, whatever. Now, whatever crimes you can accuse Soviet Russia that was not one of them. But it's sort of a reflection of the paranoia that a lot of American men in this period had.
So everything now has shifted from against the Hun, now against the Red. And the Overman committee kind of reflected that. And then you had propaganda films, the anti-German films. Now you got film, and you'll see a little clip of it as we're talking here, called, you won't, but when you see this, you will, Bolshevism on Trial, which was like a 90, I saw the whole thing. It's a 95-minute film.
Yeah.
We had a lot of, have you seen that film, Bolshevism on Trial? You got to see it. It's on the internet. And so you got this, and there's a clamp down. And at the same time, the Communist Party, which only had 40,000 members nationally, ends up splitting up. In fact, there's a scene from Reds where you see Louis Farina, and Labor Communist Party, and Jack Reed, the other one, they both have about 20 followers, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, the Communist Party was pretty small in actuality, as I mentioned in the book. Estimated 40,000 members. Actually, there were two rival communist parties at this point, 40,000 members between them, which was mighty small in a country of more than 100 million people. But in the eyes of the people who were driving this mood of paranoia, it was still a huge, huge threat.
So they're going after lefties, they're going after agitators, supposedly. There's this, and they're all supposedly immigrants. Many of them are immigrants. And tell us about, like in New York State, you had the Lusk Committee.
Yeah, because on every state, not every state, but on many of the major states, they mimicked what was going on the federal level. Politicians saw that going after Reds, investigating subversives, was a great way to get publicity, to get government funding for something that you were doing, to seem to be on the forefront of fighting the evils of the day. And so there were state level, and in some cases city level, red hunting groups, as well as the national ones. When in the Palmer raids, Attorney General Palmer made a big splash nationally by rounding up radicals all over the country and holding them in jail and trying to deport them, states started their own investigative groups. The Lusk Committee in New York, under a state senator, Clayton Lusk, wrote an enormous 4-volume report. John B. Trevor worked for them, had a lot to do with that report. And there were similar operations in other states as well.
Right. But they're going after immigrants connected that might be red. I mean, that's the cover, right? And it feeds their anti-immigration position, and at the same time, they can look like they're being tough on Reds. In fact, they hired. I mean, I don't know who hired, but there were a lot of. There was a need for translators. There were so many different languages, from all of these immigrants.
Yeah, there was a large foreign language press in the U.S. There still is to some extent, although of course everything is switched to online. And in a time of paranoia, people get especially paranoid about something that's going on in languages that you can't understand. If you think that there are Reds on all sides of you who are plotting subversion, it's all easier to fear that and to think that if this plotting is going on in newspapers you can't read because they're in Slovak or Polish or Japanese. So the government employed several dozen people who worked in a special Bureau of Translations housed in the main post office in New York City that translated the foreign language press looking for subversive tendencies of one sort or another. At one point, they panicked because they discovered a newspaper in Ladino, that's the language spoken by Sephardic Jews. They didn't have a Ladino speaker. What was this newspaper saying? Finally, with much effort, they found a Ladino speaker at some other government agency and got him to translate the paper, and he said, it's nothing to worry about.
Right. Well, so now the APL, the American Protective League, has reorganized, and they've found and Leo Wendell, Joe Walsh is back in action. In fact, Joe Walsh is in this book throughout. And there were a lot of people like Joe Walsh, who was an informant, Hoover's favorite.
Lewis Walsh was the cover name for a man named Leo Wendell, who was an undercover agent for the Department of Justice, who was sent to Pittsburgh in 1917 because the department was very worried about organizing going on there, that the Wobblies were going to set up a Pittsburgh branch. This was a crucial industrial center. They wanted this place monitored. Wendell, under the cover name of Walsh, was so convincing, playing the role of a Wobbly, that he actually got elected secretary of the local Wobbly branch. And for the next 3 or 4 years, he led demonstrations and marches. He went to meetings. He joined the city's radical library. He became friends with people in other left-wing groups in town, the whole time sending 3 or 4 reports a week to the Justice Department about what he was doing, what he was finding out. Thanks to the National Archives, which are back in the news these days, you can actually read those reports.
Wow. The anti-immigration was really reaching a fevered pitch. And then Gregory, who was the attorney general, was really reactionary. He leaves, and in comes Palmer, and people felt relieved when A. Mitchell Palmer gets the gig, because here's a guy, as a senator, I believe, or a congressman, one of the two, he supported an 8-hour-day women's suffrage and clemencies for those who had been in jail, COs and Wobblies who resisted, or opposed the war.
Yeah, clemency for some people in jail, not too many of them, but he managed to persuade Wilson to let out maybe 100 of the several hundred political prisoners that were in jail. And people expected he would be a more enlightened attorney general because he'd had a good progressive track record as a member of Congress. However, he had his eye on the 1920 presidential nomination when it was pretty clear Wilson was not going to run again, especially clear after Wilson had his severe strokes. And Palmer saw the way to that nomination as being a tough law and order candidate. And he was ideally suited to do that, being positioned as the country's chief law enforcement officer. And so he staged what are known as the Palmer raids, where they made a series of raids in dozens of cities around the country, late 1919, early 1920, rounded up some 10,000 people and targeted them for deportation because a large proportion of them were not U.S. citizens. And Palmer hoped to campaign for the presidency on the grounds of having shown he could defend us against all these dangerous radicals, because here were these hundreds and hundreds of people whom he had succeeded in deporting. But his plans were foiled, and that's another part of the story.
Right. Well, talk about that story. Also, the June 1st bombing, there were 7 cities on the eastern part of the country, coordinated bombings, and his house was bombed in Washington, D.C., Palmer.
That's right. There was a small group of Italian-American anarchists. People believe they didn't have more than about 50 supporters in the entire country, who planted a series of bombs around the country in June 1919, and actually had planned a much larger network of bombings that never came off. One of those bombs blew up Palmer's house. Palmer himself escaped, but the bomber actually killed himself because he tripped on Palmer's front doorstep, and the bomb went off before he could get away from it. This understandably upset Palmer. He wanted to find the people who'd done the bombing. But in all of these arrests of the Palmer raids, they never were able to find and convict the actual bombers. By this point, though, Palmer was running for president and was much more concerned about how he could use the raids for that purpose.
Right. Well, he brings in, at this point, after the bombing, he brings in this guy who worked for the Library of Congress by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, and he ran the radical division. Why was he why was he so taken by Hoover?
Well, Hoover was at this point 24 years old, just beginning a very long career as really the most powerful unelected American of his time. He worked for the Justice Department several years, proven himself to be a ferociously hard worker. Palmer had this great new plan to put extra surveillance on the radicals in the country and organize a big database of them, figure out who they all were so he could set about deporting the ones who were not U.S. citizens. Hoover felt he knew the technology for that database, which would be file cards, because when working his way through college and law school at the Library of Congress, he'd gotten fascinated with the library's file card system. So in 1917, Hoover started working at the Justice Department. 1919, Palmer made him head of what was then called the Radical Division. And Hoover really helped plan these Palmer raids, which happened about 6 months later. They should really be called the Hoover raids because he was the real brains behind them.
Right. So you have this going on. You have, I mean, they're raiding everybody. In the South, the lynchings have gone. I mean, everywhere there's a lynch mob, and there's one story that really is so heartrending. Is that couple down there that were both lynched. I don't know what state it was in, but I think maybe Georgia, a man and his wife.
Yeah, this was the state of Georgia, where there was a farmer who was known for mistreating his workers. The local jail leased out prisoners to him to work on his land. One of the prisoners finally struck back at him, killed the farmer, was promptly lynched, and people in the surrounding area were white people were so upset by this that they went on a lynching rampage. Nobody knows exactly how many people were killed, but it appears to have been at least 10 black people murdered, one of whom was the wife of the man who had assassinated the farmer, who was pregnant, made the mistake of speaking out against her husband's killer. She was lynched, and as she was being lynched, the baby was cut out of her womb, and it was stamped to death. I mean, it is amazing and horrible to realize that things like that went on in this country.
Well, there were
on such a large scale.
70 lynchings in 1919. It's a lot of lynchings, and including 17 vets, black vets that were lynched. At that point, there were 380,000 black veterans in this country that were out of work, looking for jobs, and joining the rest of the doughboys that had come back. So what happens then? You got the lynchings, you got Palmer, and then what you call Red Summer, what's called Red Summer. And it goes, you got the Boston police strike, you got the Broadway actors going on strike, you got the steel strike in Gary and Pittsburgh in 1919. I think that's that was the high point of people on strike, was the steel strikes. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, these were workers everywhere who were protesting because wages had not caught up with the rampant inflation of the war years. And so they went on strike. The government was desperate to suppress these strikes, did so, often with federal troops. General Leonard Wood, whom we talked about earlier, was a commander of some of those troops, finally got the strikes suppressed. And by the next year, inflation eased and labor militants dropped off, in part because labor unions really were crushed during this period. Even the very moderate American Federation of Labor lost 1 million members in this era. So many states passed laws that made labor organizing more difficult than it had been. So in a way, one thing that brought the Red Scare to an end was that it accomplished its purposes. It crushed dissent. It crushed the labor movement. Another thing that brought it to an end, by the way, is that Attorney General Palmer, hoping to base his presidential run on the Red Scare, had made the mistake of believing his own rhetoric and predicted widely and repeatedly that May 1st, 1920, May Day, the International Workers' Holiday, would see a nationwide communist uprising. So all over the country, they called out extra police shifts. They put the National Guard on alert. J.P. Morgan hired extra guards. Other tycoons and big businessmen did the same thing. The day came and nothing happened. And this sort of took the wind out of Palmer's presidential campaign and out of the Red Scare generally.
Well, but it still continued. The war on dissenters. You talk about this case in Syracuse, these 3 pamphleteers that had the pamphlets that said, "Let them go, the war is over." What happened to them?
They were sent to prison for more than a year just for demanding the release of political prisoners. Something similar to what happens today in places like Iran, but this was happening here in the United States. The Red Scare did end finally, but it took a terrible toll. And I think there were ways in which the American left never really recovered from it.
We just have a few more stories here I want to talk about, and that is I want to talk about you say Palmer was running for president, as was Leonard Wood. They both thought that they were locks, but you have the first break, and that is the U.S. attorney in Philadelphia, Kane, who resigns. Why did Kane resign?
Because he felt that the Palmer raids were nonsense, that they were not called for, that they were not arresting people who were any threat to the country. And both he and another Justice Department official in California pointed out to Palmer, look, a lot of the reports we're getting about subversive activity here or there are coming from private detectives who are hired by corporations who are trying to stir up business for themselves by making us think that we're on the verge of a communist revolution. And we're not.
Right. And so it continues. People are put on. There's a great story here. They round up a lot of people, including Emma Goldman. They put her on that boat. And on that boat, the tugboat that takes her to somewhere near the Verrazano Bridge, you have Hoover sitting with her.
That's right. The Palmer was trying to show everybody that he was militant about deporting troublemakers from the United States. They managed to get a shipload of people, 249 people, who were deportable because they were radicals, but they were not American citizens. And they put them on a boat. They parked the boat way out in the harbor near where the Verrazano Bridge is today, in order that there wouldn't be demonstrations on the pier. So the boat was anchored out in the harbor. Middle of the night, they rounded up the deportees who were being held at Ellis Island, a place that had previously been a place of hope for immigrants coming into the United States, put them on the tugboat and on a barge attached to the tugboat. One of the deportees was Emma Goldman. And Hoover had brought a group of members of Congress to see these dangerous radicals being deported, thereby burnishing the image of his boss, Palmer. And one of the members of Congress was there for this confrontation between Hoover and Emma Goldman, which took place in the kitchen of this tugboat as it was chugging across New York Harbor. An amazing scene. It deserves to be in a movie like Reds. And why 1,000 people haven't written about it before, I do not know.
Well, it's a great story. Now, this immigration, Ellis Island is inundated with people in bad conditions. This is all show for both Hoover and for Palmer. They were just taking anybody willy-nilly and putting them on and they had these, these trials, inside Ellis Island or hearings, and most of the time they were put on the ships until Lewis Post steps in, which was an act of God, how he got into that position as the acting leader.
He's one of the heroes in American Midnight. Lewis F. Post was acting Secretary of Labor, and here's why that was important. Palmer's Justice Department had the power to arrest people, but deportations, that is, of people who were not American citizens, had to be approved by the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Labor Department. The Secretary of Labor was on sick leave. The person who normally would have taken his place, who was a big buddy of Hoover and Palmer's, just resigned to run for Congress. And so the third ranking person in the department became acting Secretary of Labor. And Lewis F. Post was a very decent guy. He was not a socialist. He was not an anarchist, but he was somebody who believed that nobody should be deported from the United States because of his or her political opinions. And he invalidated most of the arrest warrants. He released thousands of prisoners from jail and saved them from being deported from the US. He infuriated Palmer and Hoover by doing this. They went out to get him. They tried to get Congress to investigate him. They did get Congress to investigate him, but Post handled himself very well in the hearing, charmed the members of Congress. They got the American Legion to demand his firing, but he wasn't fired. He held his job until the very last day of the Wilson administration.
Wow. Now, there are two other incidents that took place that dealt a big blow to Palmer and Hoover, and that was those people in Boston, the 18 petitioners in Boston. I don't know if they were in jail, but there were 18 people that had been arrested, and the judge Anderson, found them all innocent and had some very stinging words to say about the raids and Palmer.
Yeah, this was a test case in Boston, testing the legality of holding in prison these people who'd been arrested under the Palmer raids. And it came before a very enlightened judge in Boston who found the Justice Department had violated all kinds of procedures and how they made the arrests and the conditions they were keeping these prisoners in. And he released all the prisoners who were involved in the case and made an excoriating statement about how badly the Justice Department had behaved. That helped put the kibosh on what Hoover and Palmer were doing. The other thing that helped was that same spring of 1920, a group of very distinguished, a dozen law school deans and law professors, including a former U.S. attorney or two, including a retired judge, issued a very comprehensive statement with evidence and photographs documenting how illegally the government had acted in carrying out the Palmer raids. This was taken very seriously by the newspapers. It was front page headline news. No one really noticed that Louis F. Post was the person who made both of those things happen. Right. He designed the test case, and he lined up the people who wrote that report.
And Felix Frankfurter was part of that, the 12 lawyers report, and he and Post ended up being on a Hoover file. Now let's get to the end of it, toward the end of the book. Debs, doesn't get out right away. Wilson refuses. He's totally obstinate, doesn't want to have anything to do with his release. He even says that. And Harding wins, and he's sworn in March of 2021. He brings Debs in. I think Doherty was his attorney general. Yeah. He brings him up, and they have a conversation. Then he's sent right back to that Atlanta prison.
No, it's an amazing thing. Harding, he's not thought of as one of the great American presidents, but actually on some issues he was pretty good. He campaigned on the platform of return to normalcy. That was his campaign slogan. Some people think he invented the word, but it was actually there before he
normalcy
used it. And he thought all this political repression was uncalled for. He'd been a newspaper publisher before he entered politics, didn't like press censorship. He stopped it immediately. And he started rather slowly, but deliberately letting political prisoners out of jail. Debs was released sort of on parole and asked to board a train and go to Washington and meet with Harding's attorney general, which he did. Then he took the train back to the prison. And then finally, on Christmas Day, 1921, Harding released him and invited Debs to stop in for a visit in Washington on his way home. Debs did so. They talked for half an hour or so. And when Debs left Harding's office after that talk, he said to reporters, I've run for the White House 5 times, but this is the first time I've ever gotten here.
Right. So that it finally, but there were other people that were still in prison. And we get back to Kate Richards O'Hare, who leads what's called the Children's Crusade. What a brilliant idea that was.
Yeah, she rounded up wives and children of these political prisoners who were still behind bars. They traveled around the country. They went down parades down Main Street in one city after another. And finally, they showed up and picketed the White House for 2 months. And that was what produced the largest burst of released political prisoners. Then Harding died in office 2 years into his presidency. Coolidge in 1924 that the very last federal political prisoner was released.
That was it. And then I know Governor Smith released a lot of those on state charges, because there were, if you go around the country, it's at least double what the feds had in prison.
Yeah, there were at least as many people in state prisons under copycat laws that copied what the Espionage Act had.
New York State, California, Montana in particular. Well, you know, we've come to the end of the book. What's the sequel to that?
I haven't figured it out yet, Randy. I'm open to all ideas.
It's a brilliant book, folks. If you get a chance, go to Barnes & Noble or to a local independent bookstore. I know you recommend that. But if you can't get it there, because like I said on the first show, I went to Barnes & Noble, got the very last copy. Then I went, before I did that, I tried to get it on Amazon, said out of stock for a couple of days. And I knew I had to interview Adam. So I ran early in the morning, was the first person inside Barnes & Noble in Union Square, and got this book. And it's like the best decision I've ever made, during the holiday season. And
well, that's lovely to hear. There are 2 new printings in the works, so there should be more copies in bookstores very soon if they aren't already there right now.
All right. Now, we're going to close here with some music. I want to thank Kelly Lane, who, she not only is our engineer, but she has to put all these videos and pictures in. And we're going to have a long session over the next 4 or 5 days, putting photos into this one and some B-roll. But we're going to go out. A lot of those soldiers that came back, in 1918, 1919, that came back, those millions of soldiers, many of them got stiffed. They had nowhere to go, and they didn't get whatever the government had promised. And so this is a tune called, and it's from Gold Diggers of 1933. It's Joan Blondell and Etta Mooten singing My Forgotten Man. We're going out with that. And I just want to say goodbye. I know you haven't seen this, so watch this. And thank you very much, folks.
Remember my forgotten man? You put a rifle in his hand. You sent him far away. You shouted, hip hooray! But look at him today. Remember my forgotten man. You had him cultivate the land. He walked behind a plow. The sweat fell from his brow. But look at him right now. And once he used to love me. I was happy then. He used to take care of me. Won't you bring him back again? 'Cause ever since the world began, a woman's got to have a man. Forgetting him, you see, means you're forgetting me. Like my forgotten man.
Remember my forgotten man. You put a rifle in his hand. You sent him far away. You shouted hip hooray. But look at him today. Remember my forgotten man. You had him cultivate the land. He walked behind